Hi, everyone. Uh, Welcome to this online information session at the UBC Department of Political Science. We're delighted to have you all here. We'll be introduced in a moment. Just want to let you know that the aim of today's session is to give you some basic information about our MA program and our PhD program in political science. And you'll hear from faculty, staff, and a student. And we will also leave a good amount of time at the end to answer questions that you have. There'll also be opportunities for you to connect with us after the session to answer other questions. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that the University of British Columbia's Point Grey campus, where we are today, hopefully you can see a little bit out the window, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. The land that UBC is situated on has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam people, who for millennia have passed on in their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. Okay, and I think for the moment, we're going to turn off the webcam so that you can focus on the slides that are going to have a lot of information on them, but we'll see you all after we've finished our presentation for question time.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for dropping by our online information session. So just a few housekeeping pointers here. So please ensure that your mic is muted to avoid background noise during the presentation. And if you have any questions at any time, please type them in the chat box on your lower right-hand side. And I'm just typing test here so that you can see it. And then we will try and answer that during our Q&A question at the very end. And also, a recording of the session and a copy of the slides will be provided to all the participants. And that would also include some FAQs and some application tips for your application. So just a little bit of a rundown of our agenda. We will have a little bit about the UBC and the Department of Political Science. And then Alan Jacobs will do a little bit of like the field and study of research and the PhD program overview. And then we have Antonin to give us a little bit of the about the student experience. And then we have Lisa to give us a rundown of the graduate outcomes and a little bit of the faculty research. Like I said, at the end, we'll have a question and answer. So again, about us, this is, of course, Dr. Alan Jacobs, who is our Director of Graduate Programs at the Department of Political Science. And we also have Dr. Lisa Sundstrom, who is our field chair for comparative politics, and Antonin, who is a current PhD student and also president of the Political Science Graduate Student Association, and myself, Christopher Fernandez. I am the graduate program coordinator for the department, and then I would be able to answer some of your application and technical questions at the end. So I'll just want to give an overview of UBC at a glance, just to give you a sense of how big UBC is. So currently, right now, we are number 34 in the world in our university rankings. We have about 65,000 students in Vancouver, 55 in Vancouver, and about 10,000 in Okanagan. We have about 16,000 international students in 156 countries. We have 13,000 degrees conferred in 2017, about 325,000 plus alumni in 140 countries, and about 16,000 faculty and staff, 2.6 billion in operating fund, and 600 million per year in research funding, and over 8,000 projects. And we're about 12.5 billion in economic impact, and about thousands in a research project with industry partners. And this is just to give you a scope that UBC is probably the largest university in British Columbia, just to give you a magnitude and the scope of that. Now, a little bit about our department. We currently are at 52 PhD students at the moment, and we have 34 MA students. 48% are female, 52% are male. 45%, half of that is international students. So we have a very strong international body. And 36 are tenure track faculty. Now, I'm just going to do like a quick rundown of our affiliated centers and research institutes. So first would be the Institute for European Studies. And this, they seek to advance the study of and understanding of European politics. And they host speaker series, research colloquia, and conferences. Currently, the director for that is Antje Ellerman. And we have a few faculty who are affiliated with that as well. So Dr. Alan Jacobs, Lisa Sundstrom, Alan Sens, and Yves Tiberghien. So this would be the Lou Institute. And then second would be the Lou Institute, which is founded in 1998. And this is a research hub for our emerging global issues with current focus on anything related to development, environment and conflict, and emerging forms of politics. So third on that is the Institute of Asian Research, which was founded in 1978 and is a focal point for Asia-related activities in the university. And then we have our Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies, which is an interdisciplinary research unit for critical theory in politics and indigenous research, arts research, and applied social practice and social sciences in the indigenous practices in British Columbia. So it hosts the First Nations and Indigenous Studies, the FNCC, which is a subfield of a program as well in the university. So currently right now we have Glenn Coulthard and Cheryl Lightfoot as our affiliated faculty. And then our Institute for Research and Institute for Research, Environment and Sustainability is an interdisciplinary research institute which have a wide expertise in the topics of environmental politics and sustainability. So our affiliated faculty for that is Peter DeVerne and Catherine Harrison. Now we also have our JRSJ, or the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice, which specializes on critical race theory, ethnic studies, indigenous studies, media studies, and feminist politics and methodologies, and also with migration and racialization with social justice and policy. Now we also have a US Studies program, which is specifically looking at the in-depth understanding of US politics, economics, and history. And currently, Paul Quirk is our director for that program. We also have the Center of Study for Democratic Institutions, which advances the research about democratic knowledge and governance. And it also institutes the Summer Institute for Future Legislators, which is an innovative program that prepares people for public life. And it's one of the major activities in the center. So currently, right now, Max Cameron is our managing director for that program. And then lastly is the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, which is our leading policy school, and which focuses on 4 research sectors of social policy and health, fiscal economy and policy, energy and environmental policy, and international policy and trade. So with that overview of our courses that we offer, so we have, of course, courses in political theory, comparative politics, international relations, Canadian politics, US politics, and indigenous politics. And I'll bring it up to Dr. Alan Jacobs to give us the MA program overview here.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So this is Alan Jacobs. I'm a professor in the department and also the director of the graduate programs. And I'm going to just say a little bit to give you a sense of how the MA program works and then how the PhD program works. I'll talk about the main requirements, sort of what you have to do to get each of those degrees, and the timeline on which those things unfold. So as you can see on this slide, there are really 2 sets of key requirements to get an MA in this program. The first of those is to take a set of courses that you would take over generally over 2 semesters. So you take 6 graduate seminars. These are generally small courses maximum of 18 students. Many of them are smaller than that, and you're taking them together with PhD students. So these are very serious academic political science graduate courses. And as Chris said, you can take these in a whole range of areas: political theory, comparative politics, international relations, Canadian politics, US politics, Indigenous studies. Okay, and then in addition to those courses, students must write a thesis. And the thesis is generally in the range of about 35 to 40 pages, about the length of a journal article. And the idea behind the thesis is that you're taking a seminar paper that you wrote for one of the 6 courses, something that's very much in your area and that you got encouraging feedback on, that this could really be developed into a great piece of original research. And for the thesis, you're taking that seminar paper and deepening it, refining it, maybe adding some additional data, some additional analysis to it, and turning it into a really polished piece of original research. In some cases, students go on to publish their MA theses. It's one of the reasons we have them they take the form of essentially a journal-length paper. So those are the main requirements, and most students finish that in a year. It is a 1-year program. We'll see on the next slide the way that this sort of plays out over the course of a year. So generally in the fall term, one would be taking 3 courses, and also working as a teaching assistant. So nearly all of our MA students get a chance to join in helping us deliver our undergraduate program by serving as teaching assistants in undergraduate courses. And then the spring term, you would take another 3 courses, and again, do some TA work, teaching assistant work in that term. And the summer would typically be devoted to working on that thesis. And you're working with closely with a faculty member who is your thesis supervisor and gives you advice. And then at the end of that, toward the end of the summer, you'll be defending the thesis. You'll present it and be asked questions about it by both your supervisor and a second faculty member who will also give you feedback. Funding for the MA program works roughly as follows. So we do provide funding for all entering MA students. And the basic funding package, the core of that is employment as a teaching assistant. So generally speaking, you would get appointed to a full TA shift, which is 12 hours per week over 15 weeks in the fall, and the same thing in the spring. And for each of those semesters, you would get about $6,000 in pay. So it's about a $12,000 joint package. Your applicants to our program and students in our program are encouraged to apply for SSHRC funding, for SSHRC fellowships to help fund their MA studies, which a number of entering students or students who are in the program do win, and that can massively boost your funding. For our very top admits, we also will cover tuition, so an additional $5,000 in support. And while you're in the program, you have an opportunity to apply to the Faculty of Arts for a bit of travel funding to attend a conference, for instance, or to do some research up to about $500. All right, let's talk a bit about the PhD program. So the PhD program is, of course, it's a longer-term commitment, and it trains students for a range of careers afterwards, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It certainly has a strong focus on training students for careers in academia, but many students find that the training that they get in our program equips them very well for programs outside academia, and we'll talk a bit about that. Okay, so on the next slide, we have the main requirements of the PhD program. So like with the MA, you take a set of courses up front. It is the PhD requirement is 12 courses, so 2 years of coursework typically, rather than 6. And again, you're choosing from the same basic set of courses across all of those fields that we talked about earlier. If you have done an MA before, then you can also request, and most students who enter our PhD program will have done an MA before, although it's not strictly required. You can request to get credit for those MA courses toward the 12 courses for the PhD. So many students don't end up having to actually do 12 courses while they're at UBC, but rather are transferring some courses in and then taking a set of courses here. After you're done with your coursework, the next step is to take a comprehensive exam. And the idea behind the comprehensive exam is to demonstrate your mastery of your main field of study, to demonstrate that you are ready to teach in that field, that you're ready to go off and do research in that field. There are 5 fields that you can choose from. These are going to sound a lot like the areas that we have courses in, which of course is very intentional. So you can take your comprehensive exams in political theory, which is essentially political philosophy, in comparative politics, in international relations, in the politics of Canada, or in the politics of the United States. And there's a sit-down component to that exam. There is a sort of take-home component where you are writing a short paper that is actually already starting to develop ideas for your dissertation, which is what comes next. And then there's an oral exam where a couple of faculty members ask you questions to, again, sort of test your mastery of this field. And I think our students find that studying for this exam, while it is, studying for an exam and it's of course stressful, it's a tremendous opportunity to consolidate your knowledge that you've been building up over the last couple of years, and it really launches you on your way to do your own original research. The next step is to develop a proposal, a prospectus for your dissertation, and this is done together with a committee of faculty. So here you're really starting to work in an intensive way with faculty members, with a committee of generally 3 to 4 faculty members on your own research, getting advice from them, bouncing ideas off of them. They're providing you with feedback about how to develop the topic, how to develop the research design. So it's a really great research design. And then you get approval for that prospectus and present it to your fellow graduate students, get additional feedback, and then you're off to actually do the dissertation research. So you might be out doing field work, you might be reading texts, you might be downloading data and analyzing data on your computer. There are lots of different forms, of course, that political science research takes. You write up those results. The dissertation itself can take one of 2 possible forms at UBC. It can be essentially take the form of a book. So it might be 5, 6, 7 chapters that kind of hold together like a book. The other alternative is to do 3 papers, each of which sort of are of the form and length that one would typically submit to a journal. And in fact, that is what most people do in the 3-paper format do, is they then submit those papers to a journal. And these papers are going to be connected to each other, but more loosely than the chapters of a book form dissertation. And then one defends that dissertation at the end of the process. And this is a 6-year program. Funding for, the timeline, very briefly, essentially works like this. So years 1 and 2, as we talk about, are generally taken up by coursework, and then possibly doing a bit of teaching assistant and research assistant work, possibly serving as many of our students, I'd say probably most of our students, work as research assistants. That is assisting faculty with their research at some point in their time here. Some of our students often end up co-authoring and collaborating, in a very sort of horizontal way with faculty members while they're here. If you're not coming in with SSHRC funding, then you're probably applying for SSHRC funding in the first few years. Year 3 is when you're studying, at the beginning of year 3 is when you're taking your comprehensive exam and launching on to developing the dissertation prospectus, which students generally work on through most of the 3rd year, again, while doing some TAing or RAing and then they're defending that prospectus at the end of, by the end of year 3. Years 4 and 5 are really sort of where you're diving deep into that dissertation research, writing chapters or writing those papers, sending off papers to journals for getting your first publications going. And then year 6 is a year of finishing that write-up, applying for postdoctoral fellowships, applying for jobs, presenting this polished work that you're developing at conferences to get other scholars around the world aware of your work, and continuing to submit papers for publication. And then you're off. PhD funding takes a number of different forms and is fairly expansive. So we offer all students entering the program guaranteed funding for the first 5 years, and many students will get some form of funding for year 6. That funding is a combination of a substantial stipend that's just money to live on. You're not working for that money. It's just because you're here as a student. We want you to be able to devote most of your time to your studies and your own research. We give you money to live on, a stipend. We also cover your tuition, so you're not paying tuition for those first 5 years in the program. And in addition, we offer you employment as a TA. When exactly that TA employment will happen varies from student to student, but students do have opportunities to do a substantial amount of TAing and thereby supplement their income throughout their time here. Again, year 6 is typically some combination of TAing and working as a research assistant. Like MA students, we encourage our PhD students to apply for SSHRC funding, which can greatly boost the amount of resources you have available to you. We also have a fund within the department for PhD students to apply to help finance their travel to conferences to present their research, to get their findings out there, and also modest amounts of funding to support the research itself. So if you need to take a trip to do field work, for instance, or you need to hire your own research assistant to help you with working with documents, this is something the department can sometimes support.
So hello, I'm Lisa Sundstrom. I'm an associate professor in the department. I'm currently the field chair for comparative politics, and I'm also a former graduate program director in the department. So I have a bit of experience with the program. And my job right now is to talk about where our graduate students go after they graduate from the program. Where do the MA and PhD graduates end up? So the first thing I want to look over is the PhD students' academic placement outcomes. And we've done some record keeping of our graduate student outcomes in the PhD program between 2006 and 2015. And in that time period, we had 66 students graduate with PhD degrees from our department. And among those 66, 53 were actually preferring academic employment and conducted thorough full academic job searches for tenure track positions. Among those 53 students, within 4 years after receiving their PhD degrees, 36 of those 53 students were placed in tenure track equivalent positions. So if we take that ratio of the 36 out of 53 students, that translates to a tenure track position placement rate of 68%. Which is quite successful among PhD issuing departments. Where do those PhD students end up going in their tenure track positions? Well, they actually end up going all over the world. And over the past number of years that we've kept records on this, our PhDs have ended up in academic tenure track positions in Canada. We've got sort of a laundry list here, which isn't exhaustive, but gives you a good sense of the range of where students have gone. So everywhere from the University of Toronto to the University of Victoria in Canada, for example, University of Michigan in the United States and Georgia Tech in the United States, but also internationally in a number of countries, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the UK. So students, for example, have gone to University of Sheffield or Cardiff in the UK, and Australian National University in Australia. So that's just a sample of the locations where students have gone to, and you're welcome to ask more questions about this in the Q&A period if you wish. But often students decide that they don't want to go into an academic career track after the PhD, and there are plenty of opportunities to land in other professions where the kinds of skills that PhD students acquire during their program are valued. So a number of students have gone to government positions over the years. We've had students go to work with the RCMP, with Health Canada, with Statistics Canada, for example. That's within the Canadian context. But internationally as well, a lot of students have ended up in international organizations, whether they're intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations. One graduate went to the UN Women Agency, for example, recently, or the International Committee of the Red Cross, international non-governmental organizations as well, such as the World Wildlife Fund, for example. Domestically within Canada, and internationally as well, students have gone on to land at NGOs. GOPAC, the Asia Pacific Foundation, which has an office here in Vancouver, Equal Voice Canada, which promotes women's equality in politics, and MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders. And then additionally, students sometimes end up in the private sector, working in the banking industry for Deutsche Bank, VoxPop Labs, or Innovative Research are a number of examples of where they've gone. So they've gone to quite a diverse array of locations for really interesting professional careers after they graduate. Now turning to the MA placement outcomes from our MA program. We have many more students in the MA program, so there are larger numbers to deal with here. So we're just speaking right now about students who graduated between 2015 and 2018. And looking at where students have gone among the 58 graduating MAs between those years, we found that about 31% of the respondents pursued PhDs in political science after their MA in political science. Around 21% pursued government or public policy positions. Around 21% also pursued NGO or private sector employment. There were 15%, 8 people, who ended up in academic administration positions, the kinds of positions that Chris here fills. 5% ended up in international research positions. 4%, 2 people, pursued law degrees after their MA, and 2% pursued an MBA degree after they completed the MA. So there's quite a variety of directions that students go into following the MA. But we can say that a plurality, the largest number of them, do end up going on to PhD programs in political science. Okay, so in this next segment of the presentation, we want to give you just a little flavor of some of the faculty research projects that are going on in the department in a range of fields, giving you a sense of the variety of research that faculty members are conducting. And often graduate students can link up to these research projects as research assistants or as supervisees for their own research. So Alan and I are going to alternate in describing one project for each of the featured faculty members here, and we'll say a little more generally about the general other areas that they work in their research and how this connects sort of to the rest of the department. So the first example we have is from international relations. Professor Richard Price has been working recently on a new project on the influences of neuropsychology on international norm socialization. So this is a really innovative new project that explores the implications of recent findings in neuroscience literature and psychology literature, moral psychology literature, and the kinds of insights that we can gain from those literatures in other disciplines to understand international norm socialization in politics. So Professor Price is currently co-authoring a book with the Harvard scholar Catherine Sickink, who works a lot on constructivist approaches to international norms. And what they're doing in that book project is they're identifying claims in these neuropsychology literatures and looking at how they might confirm or contradict claims in the international relations literature about how norms work in international politics, how they gain traction, how they become socialized or not over time. More generally, I would say that Richard Price's work has a lot to do generally on norms in world politics. He has a particular focus on norms that are limiting warfare or use of certain kinds of weapons in warfare. He works widely in the constructivist international relations theory field, and he's published a lot of prominent, heavily cited articles in international relations theory on constructivism. He also works in the politics of international law and has worked a lot on ethics in world politics. The work that he does on norms and constructivism in his research connects quite well with others in the department. For example, Professor Katerina Coleman, who works a lot on the legitimacy of peace-building processes conducted in conflict zones by international organizations.
So I'm going to say a little bit about the work of my colleague, Professor Barbara Arneal, who happens to be the department head at the moment. So Professor Arneal is in the field of political theory, and she's worked on many different things, but her most recent book is called Domestic Colonies. And what's really innovative about this work that she's done on domestic colonies, and this is something that she's continuing to work on, is that when we think about the term colonization, we usually sort of equate it with imperialism. We think of it as settling and dominating some foreign land, right? The British Empire, Britain colonized parts of the world. But what Professor Arneal has uncovered and writes about in this book is the fact that in the 19th and 20th centuries, states around the world either proposed or created thousands of domestic colonies, that is, colonies that were actually inside their own borders and involved dominating their own citizens. So she writes about and analyzes three different types of these domestic colonies. So there were labor colonies for what were spoken of as the idle poor. There were farm colonies for citizens who were referred to as being irrational or in some way sort of mentally deficient. And then there were utopian colonies, which were places in which religious, racial, or political minorities would be dominated by some religious, racial, or political majority. And Professor Arneal analyzes sort of not just sort of what these colonies were, but also the sort of ideas and ideologies that were used to justify these domestic colonies. And in various ways, she shows they were all justified as forms of improvement, of improving the people, improving those idle poor, improving those indigenous people, improving those who were seen, in quotes, as being sort of mentally deficient, or ways of improving the land. And she really unpacks and does a powerful critical analysis of these patterns of domestic colonization that, in many countries have continued up until very recent times. And this is a book that's really forcing a rethink of colonization and colonialism, the form it takes in modern politics and in contemporary times. And this is a book that's won multiple awards from both the American Political Science Association and the Canadian Political Science Association, so it's getting a lot of attention. More generally, Professor Arneal has worked on a number of topics in the history of political thought and critical political theory. She wrote a book on John Locke. She's written on disability, on gender, and her work in that sense really connects up with a larger group of scholars, both faculty and graduate students in the department working in the area of critical theory and analyzing the roles of gender and ethnicity and diversity in politics and the ways in which power differentials among social groups shape politics.
So the next person we're going to highlight is Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot, who is both a prominent scholar of global Indigenous politics and a key person in our Indigenous politics cluster of faculty members and students, but also an international relations field faculty member. So she currently has a new project that is based on a grant from SSHRC that's about complex sovereignties in global Indigenous politics. And it's really looking at the theory and practice of Indigenous self-determination in settler states and in the international system, and looking very broadly and comparatively at a lot of different cases of different legislation, policies, and activism on Indigenous self-determination in different contexts around the world. So this, again, is a SSHRC-funded project where she is working with a co-investigator, Dr. David McDonald of Guelph University. And again, it's looking at the assertive, creative, and innovative practices of Indigenous self-determination in different contexts, multinational, cross-border, and global. Cheryl's also working on another project simultaneously, which is the politics of Indigenous apologies, that's looking at state apologies to Indigenous peoples in multinational comparative perspective. It's also notable that she was recently appointed to be the UBC's senior advisor to the president on Indigenous affairs. So she is a key person in Indigenous politics at the university and indeed around the world, I would say right now in academia. Despite her busy schedule, she is still working on her research and recruiting graduate students. So those who are interested in Indigenous politics should certainly look at her carefully. Her work on Indigenous politics connects really closely to the work of another faculty member, Glenn Coulthart, who studies Indigenous politics more in the Canadian context. And also her work on sovereignty, complex sovereignty, and new ways of looking at sovereignty connects to some extent to Assistant Professor Anna Yurkovitz, who is working on a political theory book project on possibilities of non-sovereign ways of thinking about territory and borders and land.
So Professor Xiaojun Li works on a number of issues, but to pick one of his current projects, he's interested in the role of misinformation in public opinion. Quite an important topic, of course, in an era in which we're worried about the influence of fake news and manipulation of the information people have. So at bottom, Professor Li is interested in how much citizens know about public and foreign policy, and whether their misperceptions can actually be corrected. If you give them, if they believe the wrong thing to be true, if you correct that and give them accurate information, does that actually change their views on things? So one example of this, for instance, is that Professor Li finds that Canadians are deeply misinformed about foreign direct investment from China flowing into Canada. And once you correct their misperceptions, that causes a 70% increase in the degree to which Canadians support greater FDI coming in from China. So that's one place where he has found that actually providing corrective information does change views. At the same time, we know that there are many policy areas where providing corrective information, where people have shown corrective information doesn't actually change people's views. And so Professor Li is trying to sort out sort of under what conditions can giving people the facts lead people to update their attitudes toward foreign policy and public policy issues. And he's running a set of survey experiments to get at this on a wide range of issues, such as the environment, foreign aid, immigration, and trade. We provided a link here, although to more information about this particular project, because it was recently featured by UBC's Faculty of Arts by the department as one of the exciting research projects going on right here. So you can read up more about that. And I think in the interest of time, just go on to the next one. Yeah.
So Dr. Mark Warren is a well-known scholar of democratic theory and innovations in democratic practices. And he's been working for a number of years now on a really interesting project called Participedia. And you can see the address to look it up there, participedia.net. And this is really a rich collection of data about examples of democratic innovation and participatory governance institutions and processes around the world. I really encourage you to go to the site, and you can just click around and explore all of the different examples from all over the world. Pretty much every continent in the world has examples in the database there. And this is a really interesting collaborative crowdsourced site where people can submit their own examples that they know of or that they're involved in of democratic innovation. So far, the site has collected over 300 case examples of democratic innovation, and it ranges everything from participatory budgeting processes going on in cities in Italy to town meeting practices in Abuja, Nigeria. There's a whole range of all kinds of different formal and less formal democratic process innovations that are going on around the world. He is very well known in the field of deliberative democracy more generally. So those students who are interested in studying new forms of democratic process or democratic theory in particular are often very interested in working with Professor Warren. And he connects well with other faculty in our department, ranging from comparative politics faculty members who work more on the empirical side of democratic practices, such as Max Cameron or myself, but also with, of course, political theorists like Barbara Arneal and Anna Yurkovitz, who also work on democratic theory in their own research.
Professor Richard Johnston has a new book out that is really sort of a magisterial treatment of Canada's political party system. So the sort of starting point for this analysis is the observation that Canada's party system is really unusual among Anglo-American democracies. So, compared to that of the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada's party system really stands out. There are far more parties that actually win seats in Canada than these other countries. You get massive, really big swings in outcomes from election to election in terms of the number of seats. You can have a party that goes from having a massive majority to being reduced to having just a handful of seats at the next election. The federal parties in Canada and the provincial parties in Canada often are not really closely connected to each other, even when they have the same labels. And Canada is really unusual in having a party of the center, that is the Liberal Party, for those of you who know the Canadian party system a bit, the Liberal Party that has been really a dominant party for most of the history of the country. So this book unpacks sort of the puzzle of how Canada ended up with such unusual party politics, and there's a lot to the story. One important piece of the story that Professor Johnston writes about is the interesting role of Quebec as a kingmaker. So there's the fact that French Canada has been deeply concerned throughout Canadian history with its survival as a sort of cultural national entity, worried about being swamped by sort of English Canada. And so the Francophone vote has tended to concentrate on just one party at a time. This has usually helped the Liberals, but it's also meant that when Quebec voters do decide to switch to another party, it generates this massive swing in the number of seats, giving rise to all that volatility where a party can go from having a majority to a small minority. There's a lot more to the story. This is really a path-breaking analysis that both it makes sense of Canada by comparing Canada to other democracies around the world, but it also uses insights into Canada to help shed light on party systems around the world. Professor Johnston is also a leading expert in the study of campaigns and elections. He's done a lot of work on social capital and ethnic diversity in the welfare state. And he's one of many scholars in the department who work, broadly speaking, on elections, public opinion, voting, political behavior more broadly. And we've got a number of graduate students who come here to work in those areas.
So I'm going to end my portion of the presentation about myself. So just to tell you about one project that I am working on right now. My work generally is really at the intersection between international relations and comparative politics. So sometimes I do things that look a lot more like IR, and sometimes I do things that look a lot more like comparative politics. One project I'm working on right now is called Activists in International Human Rights Courts. In my own individual research, I've been working on examining Russian human rights NGOs' strategic litigation activities at the European Court of Human Rights. So why do they do this? What do they see in this strategy? What are the results that come from it? Why choose this strategy as opposed to other strategies of activism? And also in some co-authored work with Heidi Haddad from Pomona College, I've been looking at connections between donor foundation funding, private foundation funding, and the likelihood of NGOs across Europe to use litigation at the European Court of Human Rights as a strategy. Also, sort of collaboratively with a lot of other scholars who work on activists in international courts, we're developing a network, for short, it's called Acting Courts, for conducting research and sharing research on roles and impacts of activists working through international human rights courts. So looking at both litigation strategies and patterns and activities, and then what are the results of that domestically in the home context of these activists. In that project, one of the things I'm really excited about is that we're working quite closely with human rights practitioners who work full-time in NGOs conducting litigation themselves, and sort of developing opportunities for them to participate in research and shape some of the research that we're doing, and to share their own best practices with one another about successful strategies and how to overcome some of the barriers that they face in their various contexts.
And I'll close just by telling a little bit about one of the projects I'm working on. So my work generally is in the areas of comparative political economy, comparative public policy. I do some work also on research methods. One of the things I'm working on in the area of political economy is trying to understand the relationship between economic inequality and democratic accountability. As we know, economic inequality has risen quite dramatically in many rich democracies over the last 40 years, many countries in Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand. So we've had rising concentrations of income and wealth among the top 1%, the top 0.1% of the population. And yet, in a system, in a political system where each person has an equal vote, there's really a puzzle of how could this happen? How can we have a system in which, the majority in some sense rules, and yet a tiny minority is allowed to sort of consume, receive a larger and larger share of the pie? Does this represent some kind of basic failure of democratic accountability in these systems? So one of the things that my colleagues and I have examined is how the majority are actually voting. So voters who are not rich, who are say lower and middle income voters, what do they do? How do they reward the government of the day or punish the government of the day when inequality goes up, when the very rich win out at their expense? And what we find is that across a large number of advanced democracies, we see a really perverse pattern in which the non-rich voters systematically reward incumbents for delivering greater benefits to the rich than to the rest. We're also trying to understand why that happens. And one of the suspects that we're looking into is the role of the news media. We're studying in the United States, for instance, the way in which the economic news responds to the welfare of the rich versus the welfare of the non-rich. And we're finding that US economic news systematically responds more to the ups and downs of the rich. And finally, we're trying to also understand more about how citizens think about inequality by running a set of survey experiments that are going to be examining whether people tend to support more redistribution when they're better informed about inequality, whether they tend to whether their trust in government is affected by how much inequality there is, and so on. Okay, and now we're going to turn things over to Antonin, president of the Graduate Student Association.
So hello everyone. Thank you first for being here with us. So we just heard from faculty members and Christopher on the structure of the programs, the courses, the funding. So my role now is more to talk about my experience as a student and to prepare this presentation. I've talked in the last few days with friends and colleagues in the department, trying to see if there are things that they would have liked to know before coming to UBC, or elements that are for them interesting in a program that make UBC distinct in a way. So that's how I have structured my presentation. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go on much depth on each of them. Try to highlight the big points. We can have more time to discuss during the Q&A. So we can start with the first one, who is connected to the academic opportunities. Well, first of all, we have the PSGSA had developed in the last not long ago in graduate student conference. The goal of this is to give an opportunity for graduate students, both master and PhD students, to present their work to their peers and faculty members. It is greatly appreciated. It's a good way to just receive feedback and be able to move your research forward. So that's something interesting that we have. And this is also a good example of the close relationship that we have here with the students, faculty members, and the department staff. We have the support of the faculty of the department in this specific conference, for example. But there is also a close attention to the student needs, in a sense. And a good example of that is the departmental professional workshop that I've been developing the last years. To give you an idea, we have now a series of workshops on how to plan your PhD, on publication, presentation, the job market, job talks. So there's really a preparation here to help and support the students throughout the program. Also, we have subfields workshops, so we can have you can present papers and different kind of research idea within your own subfields. And I think I'm going to stop there for academic opportunities. We can talk more on the rest if you want to during the question for the sake of time. So let's just move on to the second part, which is related to the community. Why UBC as a great help provide a good, if you want, student experience. Well, first of all, here we have the PSGSA, the Political Science Graduate Students Association. It's a great opportunity to get engaged in your own department. You can present a variety of projects. We work closely with the department to make sure that we provide the best opportunity for the students. And then this type of opportunity, we can have a few examples. We organize a series of social gatherings with people, sometimes only students, or sometimes with faculty members and department staff. So we have to build and make sure that we have a great community here. Writing groups are also something that we're working on right now to try to develop something that could be something more recurrent within the department. But there's also a series of writing groups outside the department that exists at UBC, which is a great resource for people to help them, progress in their research thesis and dissertation. After that, we have study rooms here for people. So that's a more practical side of this community, where you can just work with other graduate students and exchange on different type of project that you're doing, so to help you stay motivated toward your program. After that, there's a TA union if you want to get involved in this type of work. And just Chris mentioned at first in one of the first slides, I think something interesting interesting here is the great diversity of our cohorts. People come from all over the place to study at UBC, and that's a great trait within the department. So that's something interesting. And lastly, I think we all know that doing grad school is something sometimes a bit stressful. It's demanding. Vancouver has UBC has a great advantage of being in Vancouver. It's a great city. UBC campus is beautiful. You have access to Red Beach, to a series of forests, of parks. Vancouver is beautiful if you want to go skiing between two papers. There's Whistler not too far. Transportation-wise, it's something interesting. We have a collaboration with UBC within your tuition fees, you're paying for your own transportation, so that there's a good quality of life. You're not going to UBC only for a program. It's a beautiful thing to do, but also thinking that you have the chance of having this kind of leading department in political science in this context of Vancouver and British Columbia, which is quite fascinating. So I'm going to stop there. And if you have any question about the student experience more specifically, I'm happy to answer those questions.
Okay, so this leads us to the last portion, which is our question and answer portion for students. And yeah, we're just going to turn on the webcam here. And just also kind of like collecting the ones that the questions that we have received. So if you have any questions, again, this is the opportunity for you to type it out, and then we'll try to queue it. So depending on how much time that we have, we're going to extend for a little bit more, like 10 minutes of a question and answer portion. So for Ming Hu has a question. My bachelor major is not in political science. Is that a big negative factor in the admissions? We try to look at a very broad-based view in terms of the majors. What we really look for, and I'm assuming that you are applying here for the MA program. What we do look for is a background in the social sciences. I mean, a background in political science definitely helps, but we're looking for a strong background in the social sciences. Alan, do you want to add a little bit more about the background?
Yeah. So, for instance, if someone had a BA in sociology or in economics, but you're interested in doing an MA in political science, you should definitely apply. You're not disqualified by the fact that you don't have an undergraduate degree in political science. It's helpful if you've taken some political science, but political science itself is a pretty interdisciplinary discipline. And so we recognize that there's going to be background knowledge and skills that people may have gotten from other disciplines as well. Conceivably, even a degree from outside the social sciences might have provided background that would be useful. This is something that you would speak to in your application, in the little essay that you write. You'd want to explain how it is that the degree that you did has prepared you for political science.
Okay, so there is also actually a slide on the FAQ. So I'm just for weighing this question of the MA admission, what criteria do we look for when we are admitting applicants? So I'm just sharing, by the way, there is also an FAQ at the end of the slide in here, and we address that as well. So the next question would be, can I pursue an undergraduate PhD program without having a master's? Lisa or Alan want to address
Lisa,
that?
do you want to?
Well, I think the right answer to this question is that yes, you can. There is a mechanism for you to try and directly enter into the PhD program without an MA. Was this a question about MA in political science or MA
Without any master's?
Yeah, it is possible to do so. We would have to be quite convinced, though, of the strength of the application. And my sense is that most typically what happens in graduate admissions decisions is that often if the committee is not quite sure, they're very interested in your application and see the strengths of it, but are not quite sure if you're ready for going the distance of a PhD, they will often instead decide to offer you admission initially to the MA program, which if you do that successfully and do really well in the MA program, then you can apply to transfer to the PhD program after a year.
Yeah, it would be like sort of having a fast track into the PhD program, but we'd be asking you first to just go into the MA and show that you can perform to a high standard in graduate work. By far the vast majority of students who come into our PhD program do an MA program first, whether that's here or somewhere else. But if you feel like you're ready for a PhD program, there isn't much harm in applying to the PhD program, because in some sense, if the committee thinks that you really should do an MA first, then what they'll do is, and you've got a great application, what they'll do is admit you to the MA program, and then you can still apply to the PhD sort of, in January of that first MA year.
Yeah.
And it should be noted, I guess, that you don't actually lose time
Right.
in your progress towards a PhD in doing that, because all of the courses that you would take in our department in the MA program would then count towards your course credits for the PhD.
Exactly. So at the end of it, you're ending up on exactly the same timeline, and you've really lost nothing. So can't hurt to apply. When in doubt, apply.
Okay, so I have a question here about the best way to contact potential master supervisors, or I guess PhD supervisors if you don't know anybody from the faculty.
Yeah. Can I
Yeah.
fix that? Yeah.
Sure.
So you should feel free to directly email potential supervisors. It's a really good idea to first do your homework and read, for every faculty member, there's a web page that tells you something about what they do, often with a list of publications, maybe even links to papers that they've written. It's a good idea to first read up and make sure that the person you're reaching out to, at least broadly speaking, has some expertise or interest in your area. For a master supervisor, it is not necessary that this person be working on exactly what you do. The master's program is a much shorter program. The thesis is much shorter. So, someone who in a very general sense has some interest in the things that you do would be enough. But you want to be still being somewhat selective in who you email. So you want to reach out to one or two faculty members, and if they think that they're not the right person, they'll let you know. If they think someone else here might be a better potential supervisor, they'll point you to that person.
Okay, so I have a good question here from Brock. Can you talk more about the workshops? Do you host researchers from other universities? How targeted are they? For example, is there a political theory workshop or a democratic theory one?
So the workshops are organized by field. So when we talk about workshops, we're talking about internal forums where faculty and graduate students in the department are presenting their own work, and the group discusses the work and provides feedback on the work and helps them to improve it for publication. There is one workshop in political theory. There's one in IR, international relations, and there's one that sort of combines the three fields that are focused on the empirical study of domestic politics, and that would be comparative politics, Canadian politics, and US politics. And then in addition to those workshops, we do host outside speakers. So we have a quite lively visiting speaker program and distinguished speaker program where we fly in leading scholars from around the world in many different fields to have them give a talk, to present the current research they're doing, to meet with faculty and to meet with graduate students. We always have our visiting speakers meet with grad students. And that's a really important part of the intellectual and social life of the department.
Okay, so I have a question here from Ming Hu. Are there any scholarships or fellowships for the MA for international students? So what we have right now is that we call it the affiliated scholarships. That's one of the scholarships that you can apply within internally for the university. And that is, it's for the affiliated scholarship, it ranges for the MA for about $5,000 to $10,000 a year. Now, if you're coming in, again, and Alan has spoken about this earlier about the MA funding, is that you are expected, you will be given a TA-ship, and also if you are ranked high, and you will also get tuition coverage for the MA.
And that's regardless. That's true of international students, just as for domestic students, that you would be eligible for full TA-ships in both the fall and spring terms of your year here as well. And again, same thing for that tuition coverage for top admits. We don't, we're not distinguishing between international and domestic students for those things.
Okay. And I got a question here from Adar. Is it necessary to take a GRE exam before you apply for the MA in political science? For the MA, no, it's not a requirement. For the PhD, it is. As if your institution is not from a Canadian university, then you will be required a GRE.
That's right. And it is also, while it's not required for MA students or applicants from Canadian institutions for the PhD, it can be helpful nonetheless for all applicants. And the reason is that the admissions committee here may not know how the grading system works at the university you come from. And so it can be sometimes difficult for us to assess your transcript depending on what your home institution is. Letters of reference can also be sometimes difficult to interpret because there tends to be some inflation of praise in those. The GRE provides a standardized form of assessment. It's not perfect, and there's a lot of stuff it isn't testing for, but it does provide the admissions committee with a way to sort of a sort of standardized yardstick that we can use as sort of reliable information in assessing your file. So we encourage applicants for both, all applicants for MA and PhD to take the GRE if they can. We also encourage you to prepare for the GRE. For those of you who aren't familiar with standardized tests like the GRE, these are tests that do require some preparation, and they're sort of tests that you can learn to take well. So you want to build in, a few weeks of study time before you take the GRE.
Yeah, and I have a question again from Barack. This is a good question, and maybe Antonin as a student or Lisa could address this. Do faculty members and advanced graduate students collaborate and publish together, or is the relationship strictly at the level of advising?
I think it depends. It depends on the faculty members and the students in question, but generally there is this collaboration that tends to develop with the years, and you might not publish during your first PhD year with your supervisor or any other faculty members, but during the time when you are in the PhD, you build relationship, you identify people who works on something closely related to you. So there's, I think, an easier access for publication throughout the years.
Yeah, I do think it varies quite a bit across faculty members and students, and also how closely aligned their own research interests are. That can often play a role. I personally like to do this quite a bit. I have co-authored papers with three PhD students up till this point, and I enjoy doing it, so I'm trying to do it more and more. But I do think there is a bit of variation, and it's certainly something you could talk about as time goes on. If you're interested in that, talk about that with your supervisor in the program.
And if I may add, I think just to show a bit this kind of close relationship that I was talking about, faculty members are often quite open to just new ideas. So if you have a question, if you have something that you're super interested in, you can just go talk with them, and then you can see if it's something like worth pursuing it or just work on later. So there's a kind of open door thing going on. So if you have something interesting you want to just have a quick feedback from faculty members, they are also there for that.
Yeah, most of the faculty members I can think of in this department have collaborated with graduate students, and I think most are very open to it.
Okay, so I guess we can combine this question. For the MA admission, what are your criteria when you look at considering applicants, and what are your main expectations besides a GPA?
Academic record is by far the most important criterion for MA or PhD admission. These are academic programs, and the first thing that the admissions committee is going to look at is your transcript, as well as other evidence that your application contains about your academic abilities. So there'll be information in your letters. You want to make sure that your letters are written by people who really know your work well, right, and can speak to it in compelling detail. Again, we already talked a bit about GRE scores, which can provide some evidence on academic potential. The academic record is spoken to by transcript, letters, and GRE is important. Of course, you may have done other things that speak to your academic potential, such as you may have gotten particular kinds of methodological training. You may have worked on research projects before. These are things you want to tell us about, for instance, in that essay that you write. And you may have published, right? And we'll certainly look at that. Another thing that's important in both MA and PhD admission, although more so in PhD, is fit. So we're going to ask ourselves, is this department a place where this student, given their interests, is going to get the training, the supervision that they're looking for? Do we have the expertise among our faculty to meet the student's needs? So we could have an extremely talented student, but who works on something that no one in this department knows anything about, and then we'd have, it just wouldn't be fair for us to admit that student. So aside from sort of academic record and potential, fit is probably the most important thing that we're looking for.
Okay, since we're kind of running a little bit late here, we just have probably about time for 2 more quick questions. So I have here for our 2 comparative politics field here. I would like to know if the MA program offers regional specialization, focus on the Middle East, Africa, or Europe. I'm mostly interested in the Middle East, African, and Europe politics because I grew up in that region.
Well, I can say that we definitely have considerable strength on Europe. At this point, we don't actually have anybody in the department who focuses on the Middle East. And we have a limited amount of expertise on Africa, largely through Katerina Coleman, who works on African security from more of an IR perspective than a comparative politics perspective, but she can certainly weigh in on these things. We also have Erin Baines, who is affiliated with our department as a faculty associate who works on Africa as well, largely transitional justice processes in Africa. So we have a lot more expertise on places like Asia, particularly East and Southeast Asia, as well as Europe and Latin America, than we do on Africa and the Middle East region. That being said, particularly also depending whether you're looking at the PhD or the MA program, that matters a little bit more or less. It matters more for the PhD than the MA program. But if you are interested in working on topics, themes, research questions that connect more thematically with some of the things that other faculty members are doing, perhaps in different regions or more on a sort of cross-national basis, we may have the capacity to supervise you on particular research questions, but not necessarily have a lot of expertise in the area studies of that exact region. So it's definitely worth inquiring with faculty members, talking to Chris perhaps, or Alan a little bit about the possibilities to explore that a little bit more, depending on your particular interests.
The other thing is if there's one sort of aspect of your work that we may not have expertise in, you can have a member of your committee who comes from outside the department or even outside UBC. So for instance, it may be that you're studying democratic transitions in Africa, and we've got lots of expertise when it comes to democratization, right? So that thematic focus. But the Africa expertise may be something that we bring in a third committee member who is an Africa expert from a political science department outside UBC, and we do that sort of thing quite frequently.
Okay, so just the last question about the PhD supervision. Can students include 1 or 2 faculty members from relevant disciplines?
So that's an easy one, absolutely. Again, similarly to what I was saying before, you can have a member of your committee who is not a member of the department. That's not a problem at all, and again, happens with some frequency.
Okay, so I guess we'll wrap up the session there. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us. So Josephine at inquiries for admissions at polygrad@ubc.ca. And again, for me, Christopher.Fernandez@ubc.ca. And I'm also open to do Skype appointments or in-person appointments. For Skype, of course, if you're an international student, feel free to email me to set up an appointment at Christopher.Fernandez@ubc.ca. And again, just a reminder of our application deadline. What I would recommend for students would be to start your online application now. So the online application portal is open from now until January 7th, and this is our sort of like timeline. So we start the reviews shortly after the deadline of January 7th, and usually you will hear our offers of admissions in right around mid-February of 2019.
Yeah. So the PhDs.
Yeah.
We those offers come out earlier than the MA
MAs,
offers.
yeah.
So PhD applicants will hear a little bit earlier. The MA applicants may hear a little bit later than mid-February.
Okay. And just a little bit of a heads up also, if you are, you may want to contact your references now if you're planning to do an application, and also 2 sets of transcripts, because one is to upload, and then if you get into the program, then one would be to submit to the department. And if your transcripts are not in English or in French, please have them translated ahead of time. And again, if you're applying for the PhD program and your degrees are not for Canada, you will need to take a GRE. And also, if your language of instruction in your institutions, undergraduate and master's, or is not in English, then you also have to take the IELTS and the TOEFL. Again, if you have very specific questions, because I see some of the questions are very specific to the program, please write me an email, a follow-up email. Again, it is Christopher.Fernandez@ubc.ca. Try to book an appointment with me, and I'll be very happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we've enjoyed having a chance to talk with you and hearing your questions. And we really look forward to seeing your applications.